On November 3, 1976, in Cedar Falls, Iowa, 24-year-old Margaret Maggie O'Sullivan vanished from her apartment on College Street, leaving behind only a half-finished cup of coffee and her purse containing $17 and a grocery list written in her careful handwriting. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. We're really curious. We hope you enjoy listening to this thrilling story. Margaret O'Sullivan had always been the kind of teacher who arrived at Hawthorne Elementary before the janitor unlocked the main doors, spending the quiet morning hours arranging bulletin boards and reviewing lesson plans with the methodical precision that made her beloved by students and respected by colleagues who often struggled to match her organizational standards. Her third-grade classroom reflected a personality that found comfort in routine and took pride in creating environments where learning could flourish through careful preparation and genuine enthusiasm for educating young minds. On Monday morning, November 4th, 28 students filed into room 12, expecting to find Miss O'Sullivan greeting them with her usual warm smile, and the day's activities already outlined in neat handwriting on the blackboard that she updated each evening before leaving. Instead, they discovered an empty classroom where weekend preparation work remained unfinished in ways that contradicted everything they knew about their teacher's reliable habits and professional dedication to maintaining standards that never wavered regardless of personal circumstances. The bulletin boards displayed student artwork from the previous week's geography lesson about Iowa's agricultural heritage, with construction paper corn stalks and paper cows arranged in patterns that demonstrated Miss O'Sullivan's artistic eye and commitment to making education visually engaging for children whose attention spans required constant creativity and innovation. Her desk showed signs of interrupted work, with grade books open to pages that tracked individual student progress through reading comprehension exercises that she monitored with detailed notes about each child's strengths and areas needing additional support. Principal Donald Crawford discovered the situation when concerned parents began calling the school office to inquire about their children's reports that Miss O'Sullivan had failed to appear for morning classes. His initial assumption that illness or family emergency had prevented her attendance gave way to genuine worry when telephone calls to her apartment went unanswered, and her landlord confirmed that her car remained parked in its usual space behind the building on College Street. The scent of mimeograph ink from fresh worksheets filled the hallway outside room 12, as Crawford arranged substitute teacher coverage while attempting to contact Miss O'Sullivan through every available means. Her careful preparation for the week ahead included detailed lesson plans that extended through Friday, suggesting that whatever had prevented her Monday morning appearance had not been anticipated or planned in advance by someone whose professional habits emphasized preparation for every educational contingency. Detective Ray Morrison arrived at Hawthorne Elementary to interview colleagues who universally described Margaret O'Sullivan as the most reliable teacher in the building, someone whose dedication to her students had never wavered during 3 years of employment, that had established her reputation as an educator who treated teaching as a calling rather than merely a job. Their unanimous praise for her character made voluntary abandonment seem unlikely, while their obvious affection for her suggested that professional conflicts or workplace stress had not created pressures that might have motivated sudden departure. Linda Kowalski, who taught 4th grade in the classroom adjacent to Miss O'Sullivan's, remembered their Friday afternoon conversation about weekend plans that had included grading papers and preparing materials for the following week's science unit on animal habitats. Maggie's enthusiasm for education had been evident in her excitement about introducing students to concepts that would expand their understanding of the natural world, making her absence feel particularly troubling for colleagues who had witnessed her passion for teaching. The investigation of her apartment revealed a space that reflected the same organizational standards that characterized her classroom, with everything arranged precisely and maintained according to schedules that seemed to govern every aspect of her personal life. Her coffee cup sat half-finished on the kitchen table next to a grocery list written in the careful handwriting that her students recognized from daily blackboard lessons, suggesting that whatever had interrupted her Sunday evening routine had occurred suddenly and without warning. Her purse remained on the dining room table containing $17, car keys, and personal items that she would have taken with her for any planned departure from the apartment. The presence of these essential belongings contradicted theories about voluntary disappearance, while their careful arrangement suggested that she had been preparing for a normal Monday morning that she never experienced due to circumstances that remained completely mysterious to everyone who knew her. Detective Morrison's canvass of the neighborhood produced no witnesses who had observed unusual activity around Miss O'Sullivan's apartment building during the weekend, despite the proximity of other residents who would normally notice strangers or disturbances in the quiet residential area that catered primarily to university faculty and graduate students. The absence of obvious signs of struggle or forced entry complicated efforts to determine whether her disappearance involved criminal activity or personal crisis that had motivated spontaneous departure. Her landlord, Mr. Peterson, reported hearing classical music playing from her apartment until late Sunday evening, with Chopin Nocturnes providing a soundtrack for what had apparently been a routine weekend of lesson preparation and household activities. The sudden silence that had replaced familiar sounds suggested that whatever had changed her circumstances had occurred during late evening hours, when most neighbors would have been asleep and unlikely to witness events that might explain her absence. The university community's reaction to news about Miss O'Sullivan's disappearance reflected the broader impact of her teaching on families whose children had thrived under her instruction. Parents who had observed her classroom interactions during school conferences and volunteer activities struggled to imagine circumstances that would have caused someone so devoted to education to abandon responsibilities that clearly defined her identity and provided meaning for her daily existence. Morrison's growing understanding of Margaret O'Sullivan's character and habits suggested that her disappearance represented a genuine mystery that couldn't be explained through conventional assumptions about young women who might have left town to escape romantic problems or family conflicts. Her obvious contentment with teaching and deep connections to the Cedar Falls community made voluntary departure seem inconsistent with everything that friends and colleagues knew about her values and long-term goals. The classroom that remained prepared for students who would never again experience Miss O'Sullivan's patient instruction became a monument to dedication that made her absence feel particularly tragic for everyone who had witnessed her commitment to education. The careful arrangement of learning materials and thoughtful preparation for lessons that would never be taught created a lasting impression of loss that extended far beyond simple concern about a missing person to include grief for educational opportunities that had been interrupted by circumstances that no one could understand or explain. Thomas and Catherine O'Sullivan received the phone call about their daughter's disappearance while finishing Monday evening chores on their family farm outside Waterloo, where 3 generations of O'Sullivans had worked the same acres that now seemed inadequate to contain their growing anxiety about circumstances they couldn't control or understand. Catherine's hands shook as she hung up the telephone, her maternal instincts immediately recognizing that something terrible had disrupted the predictable life that Maggie had built for herself in Cedar Falls. The drive to meet with Detective Morrison required an hour of country roads that passed through landscapes where Maggie had grown up exploring creek beds and helping with harvest activities that had instilled the work ethic and attention to detail that characterized her approach to teaching. Thomas gripped the steering wheel of their pickup truck with hands that had spent decades managing farm equipment, now struggling to process information about his daughter's disappearance that challenged every assumption he had made about her safety and independence. Catherine clutched a Polaroid photograph taken during Easter dinner 8 months earlier, studying Maggie's smile for clues she might have missed about hidden troubles that could have motivated departure from the life she had seemed to enjoy so completely. The image captured their daughter wearing the blue dress she had sewn herself, surrounded by family members whose obvious affection for her made current circumstances seem impossible to reconcile with the happy young woman who had never expressed dissatisfaction with her chosen career or living situation. The sound of AM radio static filled the truck cab as Thomas tuned between stations, seeking news updates about the search while avoiding conversations that felt too frightening to pursue completely. Both parents understood that discussing their worst fears might make them real, while maintaining optimism required ignoring possibilities that seemed to grow more likely with each mile that brought them closer to official confirmation that their daughter had vanished without explanation or apparent cause. Detective Morrison's initial interview with the O'Sullivans revealed a family relationship characterized by regular communication and mutual respect that made Maggie's failure to contact them particularly troubling. Her weekly telephone calls home had never varied from Sunday evenings, when she would share stories about her students and seek advice about lesson planning challenges that connected her professional life to the supportive foundation that her parents had provided throughout her educational journey. Catherine's detailed knowledge of her daughter's habits and preferences allowed her to identify inconsistencies in the circumstances surrounding Maggie's disappearance that seemed significant to investigators seeking to understand what might have changed her normal routines. Her observation that Maggie would never have left dirty dishes in the sink contradicted the state of her apartment, while her certainty about her daughter's financial responsibility made the presence of unpaid bills seem particularly suspicious and out of character. Thomas struggled to provide helpful information about Maggie's social life beyond teaching responsibilities, recognizing with growing guilt that his assumptions about his daughter's contentment might have prevented him from asking questions that could have revealed problems requiring parental support or intervention. His traditional approach to child-rearing had emphasized independence and self-reliance in ways that might have discouraged Maggie from seeking help with difficulties that seemed too personal or complicated to share with family members. The possibility that their daughter had been hiding aspects of her life from family members who thought they knew her completely created a crisis of confidence that extended beyond immediate concern about her safety to include questions about the effectiveness of their parenting and the depth of relationships they had believed were characterized by honesty and trust. Their rural background had not prepared them for complexities of urban life that might have created pressures they couldn't understand or address through conventional family support. Catherine's memories of recent conversations with Maggie began taking on new significance as she searched for clues that might have indicated trouble brewing beneath the surface of seemingly normal discussions about teaching challenges and apartment life. Her daughter's occasional mentions of workplace tensions had seemed routine until placed in the context of mysterious disappearance that suggested more serious problems than typical professional frustrations experienced by beginning teachers adjusting to institutional expectations. The investigation required Thomas and Catherine to provide detailed information about Maggie's childhood and adolescence that might reveal patterns or relationships relevant to understanding her current circumstances. Their descriptions of a conscientious student and helpful daughter created a portrait of someone whose character made voluntary abandonment seem unlikely, while their obvious pride in her achievements highlighted the tragedy of potential that might have been destroyed by forces they couldn't identify or combat. Morrison's questions about Maggie's romantic relationships forced her parents to confront how little they knew about her personal life, beyond surface details that she had chosen to share during family visits and telephone conversations. Their awareness that adult children maintained privacy about intimate relationships conflicted with growing suspicion that secrets might have created dangers that family support could have helped her navigate more safely. The emotional toll of providing information for a missing person investigation revealed the helplessness that parents experienced when their adult children faced crises that occurred beyond the protection that families could provide through love and good intentions. Thomas and Catherine's dedication to finding their daughter was matched by recognition that their rural isolation had not prepared them for complexities of modern life that might have overwhelmed someone they had raised to be strong and independent. Their faith in Maggie's character and judgment, which had previously been sources of pride and confidence, now created additional anxiety as they struggled to imagine circumstances that could have motivated someone so reliable and responsible to disappear without communication or explanation. The possibility that their daughter had been forced to leave against her will seemed preferable to alternatives that suggested voluntary abandonment of family relationships that had defined their understanding of their effectiveness as parents. The drive home to Waterloo occurred in silence that felt heavy with unspoken fears about outcomes that neither parent wanted to discuss or acknowledge as realistic possibilities. Their pickup truck retraced familiar roads that had carried them to Cedar Falls with hope for answers, now returning them to farm work and daily routines that would continue despite uncertainty that had infected every aspect of their lives with worry about a daughter whose fate remained unknown and possibly unknowable. Michael Brennan met Detective Morrison at the Cedar Falls Police Department on Tuesday afternoon, his nervous demeanor immediately suggesting complexity that extended beyond normal concern about a missing girlfriend whose disappearance had disrupted what he described as a comfortable relationship based on shared interests and compatible personalities. At 26, Michael worked as a bank teller at First National, where his interactions with customers had developed interpersonal skills that served him well during questioning that probed details about his relationship with Maggie and activities during the weekend of her disappearance. His account of Saturday evening began with dinner at Murphy's Diner, where he and Maggie had established a weekly routine of sharing a corner booth while discussing their respective work weeks and making plans for upcoming activities that had provided structure for a relationship that seemed headed toward engagement and marriage. The familiar aroma of coffee and grilled cheese sandwiches had created a comfortable atmosphere for conversations that Michael now realized might have been more superficial than he had previously understood. Morrison's experience with relationship investigations immediately identified inconsistencies in Michael's timeline that suggested either poor memory or deliberate deception about events that should have been clearly remembered given their recent occurrence and current significance. His claim that dinner had lasted until 9 o'clock contradicted the diner's closing time of 8:30, while his description of Maggie's mood as cheerful conflicted with other witnesses, who remembered her seeming distracted and unusually quiet during their final public appearance together. Michael's nervous habit of clicking his ballpoint pen during questioning revealed anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the situation, particularly when discussions focused on specific details about Saturday evening activities and Sunday communication patterns that he should have been able to recall accurately if his relationship with Maggie had been as straightforward as he claimed. The clicking intensified whenever Morrison asked follow-up questions that required clarification or additional detail about subjects that seemed to make Michael uncomfortable. His explanation for not contacting police immediately when Maggie failed to answer Sunday telephone calls demonstrated either remarkably poor judgment or calculated delay that served purposes beyond simple respect for her privacy and independence. Michael claimed that he had assumed she was visiting friends or running errands that prevented her from being available for their usual Sunday evening conversation, but his failure to check on her welfare suggested distance in their relationship that contradicted his descriptions of intimate partnership and mutual commitment. Detective Morrison's investigation into Michael's background revealed employment stability and community ties that seemed to support his claims about character and reliability, but also uncovered previous relationships that had ended under circumstances that suggested possessive behavior and difficulty accepting romantic rejection. His ex-girlfriend from college had filed a complaint about harassment that was eventually dropped when she left town for graduate school, indicating patterns of controlling behavior that might have affected his relationship with Maggie in ways that she had kept private. Michael's knowledge of Maggie's weekly routines and personal habits seemed detailed enough to suggest either genuine intimacy or systematic observation that went beyond normal boyfriend attention to include surveillance that might have been motivated by suspicion or desire to control her activities. His ability to predict her schedule and account for her typical weekend activities raised questions about the extent to which he had monitored her life in ways that she might have found intrusive or threatening. The investigation revealed that Michael had accessed Maggie's apartment using a spare key that she had provided for emergency purposes, but his visits during her absence had not been limited to genuine emergencies or situations that required his intervention. Neighbors reported seeing him enter her building on multiple occasions when they knew she was at work, suggesting behavior that violated trust and personal boundaries in ways that might have created conflict between them. Morrison's questioning about the nature of their relationship revealed Michael's expectations for increased commitment and exclusivity that might have exceeded Maggie's comfort level or desire for independence. His mentions of marriage and shared future plans seemed to assume agreement that she had never explicitly provided, while his possessive language about their relationship suggested assumptions about ownership that might have triggered resistance or desire to escape his increasing control over her personal choices. The timeline of their relationship showed escalating intensity on Michael's part that had not been reciprocated by Maggie, whose friends described her as feeling pressured by expectations that conflicted with her professional goals and personal values. His romantic gestures had become more frequent and elaborate during the weeks preceding her disappearance, suggesting awareness that their relationship was in crisis and attempts to prevent dissolution that she might have been planning. Michael's financial records revealed expenditures on gifts and romantic activities that exceeded his modest bank teller salary, indicating investment in their relationship that created pressure for reciprocal commitment that might have made Maggie uncomfortable about accepting continued generosity that implied obligations she wasn't prepared to honor. His assumption that expensive gestures would strengthen their bond demonstrated misunderstanding about her values and priorities that emphasized independence over material considerations. Detective Morrison's growing suspicion about Michael's truthfulness led to more detailed questioning about his activities during the crucial hours when Maggie's disappearance occurred, revealing additional inconsistencies in his story that suggested careful preparation for police investigation rather than spontaneous recollection of routine weekend activities. His alibis seemed too perfect, and his explanations too detailed for someone supposedly unaware that he would need to account for his time during a criminal investigation. The contrast between Michael's public persona as a reliable bank employee and concerned boyfriend, and the emerging evidence of controlling behavior and deceptive communication, created a portrait of someone whose relationship with Maggie had been more complex and potentially dangerous than their surface compatibility had suggested to casual observers. His investment in maintaining appearances might have motivated actions that prioritized his reputation over her safety and well-being. The clicking of his ballpoint pen that had punctuated Morrison's interview would remain associated with the investigation's growing focus on Michael's role in Maggie's disappearance, serving as an auditory reminder of nervous energy that suggested guilt about knowledge he was desperately trying to conceal, while maintaining the appearance of cooperation with law enforcement efforts to locate his supposedly beloved girlfriend. The investigation into Maggie O'Sullivan's professional environment revealed institutional dynamics at Hawthorne Elementary that her cheerful classroom demeanor had successfully concealed from students and most colleagues who worked alongside her, without recognizing the tensions that had been building beneath the surface of routine educational activities. Her reputation as a dedicated teacher had masked growing concerns about workplace behavior that she had documented carefully, while struggling with whether to pursue formal complaints that might jeopardize her career and professional relationships. Principal Donald Crawford's management style had created an atmosphere of intimidation that affected female teachers disproportionately, with his interactions characterized by inappropriate comments, unwelcome physical contact, and professional favoritism that rewarded compliance with his advances while marginalizing those who maintained appropriate boundaries. His position of authority within the school hierarchy provided protection from accountability, while enabling behavior that created hostile working conditions for educators who lacked sufficient power to challenge his conduct through official channels. Linda Kowalski, the fourth-grade teacher whose classroom adjoined Maggie's, struggled with conflicted loyalty between protecting her missing colleague's reputation and revealing information that might be relevant to understanding her disappearance. Her knowledge of Crawford's inappropriate behavior toward Maggie had been shared in confidence during private conversations that took place in the school library, where the smell of old books and chalk dust provided cover for whispered discussions about situations that seemed too dangerous to address openly. The library had become an unofficial sanctuary for female teachers who needed to share concerns about working conditions that threatened their professional security and personal safety. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian who had witnessed decades of educational change, provided maternal support for younger teachers while maintaining diplomatic silence about administrative problems that exceeded her ability to resolve through conventional channels available to non-administrative staff members. Maggie's personnel file contained formal complaints that she had filed through proper procedures, documenting specific incidents of harassment that included unwelcome touching, sexually suggestive comments, and professional retaliation when she declined Crawford's invitations to after-school meetings that seemed designed to create opportunities for inappropriate behavior rather than legitimate educational discussions. Her careful documentation reflected understanding that protecting herself required creating paper trails that might eventually support legal action if informal resolution proved impossible. Detective Morrison's review of school board meeting minutes revealed that Crawford's behavior had been the subject of previous discussions that were conducted in executive sessions, designed to prevent public awareness of problems that board members preferred to handle quietly rather than risk scandal that might affect community confidence in educational leadership. The pattern of institutional protection suggested that Maggie's complaints were not the first to identify problems with Crawford's conduct toward female employees. The investigation uncovered a sophisticated system of intimidation that Crawford had developed to silence potential complainants, while maintaining his reputation as a dedicated educator, whose commitment to academic excellence justified overlooking personality conflicts and communication problems that board members characterized as normal workplace tensions, rather than systematic harassment that created hostile working conditions for vulnerable employees. Female teachers who had previously worked under Crawford's supervision described similar patterns of inappropriate behavior that had been normalized through institutional pressure to avoid creating problems that might interfere with educational missions that served important community needs. Their reluctance to speak openly about their experiences reflected understanding that challenging administrative authority often resulted in professional retaliation that could destroy careers and personal financial security. The school district's insurance policies and legal protections had been structured to minimize liability for administrative misconduct, while providing maximum protection for officials whose behavior created risks that were considered acceptable costs of maintaining educational leadership that produced desired academic outcomes. Crawford's position was protected through contracts and tenure arrangements that made removal difficult even when his conduct clearly violated professional standards and legal requirements. Maggie's friend Linda revealed that Crawford had specifically targeted teachers who lacked family connections or political influence that might have provided protection from retaliation. His selection of victims demonstrated strategic thinking about vulnerability that allowed him to pursue inappropriate relationships while minimizing risks to his own career and reputation within the educational community that provided his livelihood and social status. The discovery of Crawford's systematic harassment explained Maggie's increasing stress during the months before her disappearance, as she struggled with moral obligation to report criminal behavior while recognizing that truth-telling might result in professional destruction that would end her teaching career and force her to abandon work that provided meaning and identity. Her careful documentation of incidents suggested preparation for formal complaints that she might never have felt safe enough to file. Morrison's investigation revealed that other female teachers had left Hawthorne Elementary under circumstances that seemed related to conflicts with administrative leadership, creating a pattern of turnover that the school board had attributed to normal career progression rather than workplace conditions that drove away qualified educators who might otherwise have remained in positions they had trained extensively to perform. The institutional protection that enabled Crawford's continued harassment created an environment where victims faced impossible choices between career security and personal safety. With formal complaint procedures that seemed designed to expose complainants to retaliation, rather than provide meaningful resolution for problems that violated both professional ethics and legal standards governing workplace behavior. The smell of chalk dust and old books that filled the school library, where female teachers had gathered to share concerns about Crawford's behavior, became associated with the courage required to speak truth about powerful people, whose positions provided protection from accountability. The sanctuary that the library had provided for confidential discussions represented the informal support networks that developed when formal institutional responses failed to protect vulnerable employees from systematic abuse of authority. The renovation of Maggie's apartment building began in March 2014, 38 years after her disappearance, when new ownership decided to modernize the aging structure that had served university faculty and graduate students through decades of minimal maintenance and superficial updates that had preserved original architectural features while ignoring underlying structural problems that required comprehensive attention. The project manager, Jake Rodriguez, discovered the hidden letter while removing damaged baseboards that had warped due to water damage from an upstairs apartment leak that had finally forced serious renovation work. The letter was wedged behind a loose section of baseboard in Maggie's former bedroom, preserved in a space that had remained undisturbed since 1976, despite multiple tenant changes and routine maintenance activities that had never required removing the trim work where she had concealed her final written communication. The musty smell of old wood and accumulated decades of dust created an atmosphere of discovery that felt like opening a time capsule containing secrets that had waited nearly 4 decades for revelation. Rodriguez immediately recognized the significance of his discovery and contacted Cedar Falls Police, whose cold case files included Maggie's disappearance among unsolved investigations that continued to generate periodic inquiries from family members and amateur investigators who had been following the case through online forums and true crime publications. Detective Sarah Chen, assigned to review the letter's contents, found herself reading words that challenged every assumption that had guided previous investigations into circumstances surrounding Maggie's vanishing. The letter, written in Maggie's careful handwriting that remained perfectly legible despite the passage of time, revealed her intention to disappear deliberately rather than face consequences of reporting sexual harassment that could destroy careers and relationships, while providing no guarantee of meaningful resolution for problems that had made her teaching position untenable. Her words demonstrated sophisticated understanding of institutional dynamics that protected perpetrators while exposing complainants to retaliation that could extend far beyond immediate workplace consequences. Maggie's precise language described months of careful planning that had required researching alternatives to formal complaint procedures that seemed designed to fail, while creating maximum exposure for victims who lacked sufficient power to challenge administrative authority effectively. Her decision to disappear represented conclusion that protecting herself required abandoning her identity and career, rather than fighting systems that seemed specifically designed to silence women who threatened powerful men with accountability for criminal behavior. The letter contained specific details about Crawford's harassment that corroborated complaints found in her personnel file, while revealing additional incidents that she had not documented officially due to fear about escalating retaliation that might have endangered her physical safety as well as professional security. Her descriptions of his behavior painted a portrait of systematic predation that had been enabled through institutional protection that made formal complaints seem more dangerous than silence. Detective Chen's analysis of the letter revealed Maggie's awareness of underground networks that helped women escape dangerous situations when legal protections proved inadequate or non-existent. Her references to contact information and safe houses suggested connection to organizations that operated outside official channels, while providing assistance that formal systems failed to deliver for victims whose circumstances required immediate protection, rather than prolonged legal processes that often re-victimized complainants. The letter explained Maggie's systematic preparation for disappearance that had included accumulating savings, researching new identities, and coordinating with support networks that specialized in helping women escape situations where conventional remedies seemed inadequate or counterproductive. Her planning demonstrated intelligence and courage that had been directed toward self-preservation, when institutional responses had failed to provide protection from retaliation that threatened her safety and career. Maggie's careful documentation of her decision-making process revealed understanding that disappearing would cause pain for family members and friends who would never know what had happened to someone they loved. But her conclusion that temporary grief was preferable to permanent danger reflected mature analysis of options that seemed limited by systems that prioritized institutional reputation over individual welfare and justice. The letter's existence challenged fundamental assumptions about victims' agency and choice in situations involving institutional abuse, suggesting that some disappearances represented rational responses to impossible circumstances rather than irrational behavior or external victimization by unknown perpetrators. Maggie's voice, preserved in her careful handwriting, demanded recognition that she had been the author of her own fate rather than passive victim of forces beyond her control. Chen's investigation into the letter's authenticity required forensic analysis that confirmed both the paper's age and the handwriting's consistency with samples from Maggie's school files, establishing that the document represented genuine communication rather than elaborate hoax or deception designed to mislead investigators. The scientific verification of the letter's authenticity transformed understanding of the case, while raising new questions about the effectiveness of support networks that had operated in secrecy during the 1970s. The discovery required notification of Thomas and Catherine O'Sullivan, who were still living on their farm outside Waterloo, despite advancing age and declining health that made travel difficult. Their reaction to learning that their daughter had chosen to disappear rather than face institutional retaliation created complex emotions that combined relief about her agency with grief about circumstances that had forced such an extreme response to workplace harassment. The preservation of Maggie's final written communication in the apartment, where she had made the decision to abandon her identity, created powerful connection between past and present, demonstrating how truth could remain hidden for decades, until circumstance and renovation work combined to reveal secrets that had shaped lives without ever being acknowledged or understood by those who had been affected by her disappearance. Detective Chen's investigation into the support networks referenced in Maggie's letter began with contact information that had remained surprisingly viable despite 4 decades of social change and technological advancement, leading to conversations with elderly women who had dedicated their lives to helping victims escape situations where conventional assistance seemed inadequate or dangerous. Sister Margaret Gonzalez, now in her 80s and residing in a Chicago nursing home, remembered coordinating safe passages for women whose circumstances required immediate protection rather than prolonged legal processes that often failed to provide meaningful resolution. The letter's specific references to Iowa City as Maggie's first destination led Chen to university archives that contained documentation about women's support groups that had operated during the 1970s, when federal legislation about gender discrimination was still evolving and institutional protections for harassment victims remained minimal or non-existent. The University of Iowa's Women's Resource Center had maintained careful records about their assistance programs, including transportation networks that helped women reach safer locations when local options seemed insufficient or compromised. The sound of Greyhound bus engines and diesel exhaust became associated with Maggie's journey toward freedom, as Chen traced her route through detailed bus station records that had been preserved in transportation company archives. The methodical documentation of passenger manifests and ticket sales created a paper trail that revealed Maggie's systematic progress from Iowa City to Chicago, where more sophisticated support networks could provide resources for establishing new identities and finding employment that wouldn't require references from previous educational positions. Chen's contact with the Chicago Women's Crisis Center yielded memories from volunteers who had processed dozens of women seeking escape from various forms of domestic and workplace abuse during an era when legal protections remained inadequate for addressing systematic harassment and institutional retaliation. Their recollections of a young teacher from Iowa matched Maggie's physical description and timeline, providing confirmation that the Underground Railroad for abuse victims had successfully facilitated her transition to safety and anonymity. The investigation revealed sophisticated operations that had developed to address gaps in official protection systems, with networks of safe houses, employment assistance, and identity documentation that operated outside legal frameworks while providing services that formal institutions failed to deliver effectively. These organizations had understood that some situations required immediate extraction rather than prolonged advocacy that exposed victims to continued danger, while seeking systemic change that might never materialize. Transportation records from the Chicago Greyhound Terminal showed continuing travel patterns that suggested Maggie's journey had extended beyond Illinois to destinations that remained unclear from available documentation. The interstate nature of her movement had required coordination between multiple support networks that specialized in different aspects of helping women disappear safely, while maintaining security that prevented discovery by people who might have been seeking to locate them for harmful purposes. Chen's research into 1970s women's liberation movements revealed philosophical debates about individual versus collective responses to institutional oppression, with some activists advocating for direct confrontation of abusive systems, while others supported whatever strategies helped individual women survive dangerous circumstances. Maggie's decision to disappear rather than fight represented one approach to dealing with problems that seemed to have no satisfactory resolution through conventional channels. The underground networks had operated with understanding that success meant never hearing from clients again, since continued contact could compromise security that protected both the women who had been helped and the organizations that assisted them. This operational principle meant that Maggie's successful disappearance had left no trail that could be followed by investigators or family members seeking to locate her, while also providing no feedback about the long-term effectiveness of assistance that had been provided. Sister Margaret's memories of the Chicago operations included details about employment placement services that helped women establish careers under assumed identities, often in educational fields that utilized their professional training, while placing them in communities where their previous lives were unknown. The systematic approach to identity reconstruction had required coordination with sympathetic employers and document providers, who understood the moral necessity of helping abuse victims establish safe new lives. The investigation revealed that Maggie's careful planning had included research into teaching opportunities in communities where her educational credentials could be utilized, without requiring extensive background verification that might have exposed her real identity. Rural school districts in western states had been particularly receptive to qualified teachers who were willing to work in isolated locations that struggled to attract candidates from traditional recruitment channels. Chen's contact with retired teachers' organizations in states that had been likely destinations for relocated educators yielded several possible matches for women who had begun teaching careers during the late 1970s with educational backgrounds similar to Maggie's qualifications. The process of investigating these possibilities required sensitivity about privacy concerns and respect for decisions to maintain assumed identities that had provided protection for decades. The preservation of transportation and organizational records that documented underground assistance networks created opportunities for historical research that revealed the scope and effectiveness of operations that had remained largely invisible to law enforcement and academic researchers. These archives provided insight into parallel systems of justice and protection that had developed in response to institutional failures that left vulnerable people without adequate recourse through official channels. The trail that Maggie had followed toward freedom represented one woman's successful navigation of systems designed to help victims disappear safely when confronting abuse seemed more dangerous than abandoning previous identities and relationships. Her journey illustrated both the courage required to seek such assistance and the tragedy of circumstances that made extreme measures seem necessary for basic personal safety and professional security. Detective Chen's investigation into 1970s women's support networks revealed sophisticated operations that had developed in response to institutional failures that left abuse victims with limited options for protection and justice, when conventional remedies proved inadequate or dangerous to pursue. These underground systems had operated parallel to official channels, while providing services that formal institutions seemed structurally unable or unwilling to deliver effectively for women whose circumstances required immediate assistance, rather than prolonged legal processes that often revictimized complainants. Sister Margaret Gonzalez had coordinated safe house networks through Catholic Charities operations that provided temporary shelter and assistance for women seeking to escape dangerous situations that law enforcement and court systems seemed unprepared to address adequately. Her basement office at St. Mary's Church had served as a communication center for operations that required careful coordination between multiple cities and states to ensure that women could be moved safely beyond the reach of people who might seek to harm them or force their return to abusive environments. The aroma of incense and candle wax that filled the church basement during clandestine meetings provided sensory anchors for memories of desperate women seeking alternatives to formal complaint procedures that seemed designed to protect institutional interests rather than victim welfare. Sister Margaret's recollections of these gatherings emphasized the moral imperative that had driven volunteers to provide assistance despite legal risks that could have resulted in criminal charges for people whose only crime was helping abuse victims escape dangerous circumstances. The operational security required for effective victim assistance had demanded careful screening of both volunteers and clients to prevent infiltration by people whose motives might compromise the safety of networks that depended on secrecy for their continued effectiveness. Background verification procedures had been developed to ensure that assistance was provided only to genuine victims, while excluding individuals whose involvement might expose participants to legal retaliation or physical danger from abusive partners and employers. Chen's research revealed that the underground networks had maintained detailed protocols for identity reconstruction that included assistance with documentation, employment placement, and housing arrangements that enabled women to establish sustainable new lives in communities where their previous identities remained unknown. The systematic approach to disappearance required expertise in legal procedures, social services, and employment systems that had been accumulated through years of experience helping women navigate complex transitions to safety and independence. The Catholic Church's institutional structure had provided cover for assistance activities that operated outside normal legal frameworks, while maintaining plausible deniability about operations that might have violated laws designed to prevent interference with law enforcement investigations and court proceedings. Sister Margaret's religious authority had enabled her to coordinate activities that might have been prosecuted as obstruction of justice if pursued by secular organizations with less institutional protection. Educational networks had been particularly important for helping women with professional credentials establish careers that utilized their training, while placing them in communities where extensive background verification was uncommon due to teacher shortages that made administrators grateful for qualified candidates regardless of incomplete employment histories. Rural school districts had often been willing to overlook documentation gaps in exchange for competent instruction in subjects that were difficult to staff adequately. The support networks had operated with understanding that success meant permanent separation between clients and their previous lives, including family relationships that might have been loving, but could potentially compromise security if maintained through continued contact. This operational principle had required helping women develop psychological resilience for maintaining assumed identities while grieving relationships that had been sacrificed for safety and survival. Sister Margaret's memories of specific cases included details about women who had successfully established new lives despite circumstances that had seemed hopeless when they first sought assistance from networks that specialized in providing alternatives to formal systems that had failed to protect them adequately. The long-term effectiveness of assistance could only be measured through absence of contact, since successful disappearance meant that clients never returned or communicated about their new circumstances. The philosophical foundation for underground assistance had been based on understanding that institutional systems often protected perpetrators, while exposing victims to additional harm through processes that seemed designed to discourage complaints, rather than provide meaningful resolution for problems that violated both legal standards and moral principles. The networks had developed in response to recognition that individual survival sometimes required bypassing formal channels that had proven inadequate for addressing systematic abuse and institutional retaliation. Chen's interviews with former volunteers revealed the emotional toll of providing assistance that required maintaining permanent secrets about women whose fate remained unknown to people who had dedicated significant portions of their lives to helping them escape dangerous circumstances. The psychological burden of success that could never be acknowledged or verified had created lasting impact on people whose moral courage had enabled effective operations despite personal costs that extended far beyond simple legal risks. The documentation of network activities had been minimal by design, since written records could have been subpoenaed or discovered during law enforcement investigations that might have compromised operations that depended on secrecy for their effectiveness. The absence of comprehensive archives meant that historical research required piecing together information from scattered sources and individual memories that had been carefully guarded for decades to protect both clients and volunteers. The Underground Railroad for abuse victims had represented a parallel system of justice that operated according to moral principles that prioritized individual welfare over institutional interests, when formal systems failed to provide adequate protection or remedy for circumstances that threatened personal safety and professional security. The networks had filled gaps in official responses while demonstrating that alternative approaches to justice could be effective when conventional methods proved insufficient or counterproductive. The breakthrough in understanding Michael Brennan's role in Maggie's disappearance came through technological advances that had transformed old evidence into new revelations about his calculated manipulation of circumstances surrounding her departure from Cedar Falls. Detective Chen's decision to apply modern audio restoration techniques to answering machine tapes found in Maggie's apartment required specialized equipment that hadn't existed during the original investigation, when analog recordings could only be analyzed using methods that were inadequate for detecting subtle manipulations or enhanced details. The digital processing capabilities available in 2014 allowed forensic specialists to isolate individual voice tracks from background noise, while enhancing audio quality to reveal conversations that had been previously inaudible or unclear when analyzed using 1970s technology. The enhanced recordings exposed Michael's voice making multiple calls to Maggie's apartment after her disappearance, suggesting knowledge about her departure that contradicted his claims of ignorance and surprise when she failed to answer telephone calls and missed their Sunday evening conversation. Dr. Patricia Moss, the audio forensics specialist who processed the recordings, discovered evidence of careful timing in Michael's messages that indicated strategic rather than spontaneous communication designed to establish false timelines and create alibis that would protect him from suspicion about his involvement in circumstances that had forced Maggie's departure. His calls demonstrated sophisticated understanding of investigative procedures that seemed inconsistent with genuine surprise about her disappearance. The enhanced audio revealed Michael's coaching intended to establish his concern and confusion about Maggie's absence, while simultaneously creating documented evidence of his attempts to locate her through normal channels that would demonstrate his innocence to investigators who might question his role in events that had disrupted their relationship. His messages reflected careful planning rather than emotional spontaneity that would have characterized genuine worry about a missing girlfriend. The technology that exposed Michael's deception represented advances in forensic audio analysis that had revolutionized criminal investigation by enabling extraction of information from recordings that had previously seemed to contain only unintelligible noise or irrelevant conversation. Digital signal processing had made it possible to separate individual voices, enhance clarity, and detect manipulations that would have been impossible to identify using analog equipment available during the 1970s. Chen's analysis of the timing patterns in Michael's calls revealed strategic spacing, designed to create the impression of escalating concern, while avoiding communication that might have provided Maggie with opportunities to explain her circumstances or seek assistance that could have interfered with plans that required her continued silence about harassment that had motivated her disappearance. His calculated avoidance of genuine contact suggested awareness that reaching her might have compromised objectives that prioritized his protection over her welfare. The investigation into Michael's background revealed connections to Principal Crawford that had not been discovered during the original investigation, including financial relationships that suggested cooperation in concealing harassment that had created liability for both the school district and individuals whose careers could have been destroyed by formal complaints that brought public attention to systematic abuse. Michael's bank records showed deposits that appeared to be payments for services rather than normal employment compensation. The enhanced recordings also revealed background conversations between Michael and unidentified individuals, who provided advice about managing law enforcement investigation, while minimizing exposure to criminal charges that could have resulted from conspiracy to silence harassment victims through intimidation or bribery. The audio evidence suggested coordination with people whose experience with covering up institutional abuse had provided expertise that Michael had utilized to protect himself and his associates. Detective Chen's reconstruction of events revealed that Michael's relationship with Maggie had been compromised by his dual role as boyfriend and informant, whose responsibility involved monitoring her intentions regarding formal complaints against Crawford, while influencing her decision-making through emotional manipulation that prioritized institutional protection over her personal safety and career security. His betrayal had extended far beyond simple romantic deception to include systematic sabotage of her attempts to seek justice through proper channels. The audio restoration technology had also revealed evidence of recording equipment that Michael had used to document private conversations with Maggie about her intentions regarding harassment complaints, suggesting surveillance activities that violated her privacy, while gathering information that could be used to develop strategies for preventing formal reports that might have triggered investigations and legal proceedings. His behavior had been that of an intelligence operative rather than a supportive romantic partner. The discovery of Michael's deception required reopening investigation into Crawford's harassment activities and institutional responses that had enabled his continued employment despite multiple complaints that should have triggered disciplinary action and criminal prosecution. The coordination between Michael and school administrators suggested conspiracy to silence victims through methods that included romantic manipulation designed to control their decision-making about seeking justice. Chen's interviews with Michael's former colleagues at First National Bank revealed knowledge about his involvement in activities that extended beyond normal banking responsibilities to include financial services for people whose business seemed designed to avoid official documentation and regulatory oversight. His access to banking resources had enabled him to facilitate payments and transfers that supported operations requiring financial secrecy and plausible deniability. The enhanced audio evidence demonstrated that Michael's nervous behavior during original police interviews had been motivated by guilt about his role in forcing Maggie's disappearance, rather than simple concern about her welfare or fear that he might become a suspect in criminal investigation. His clicking ballpoint pen had provided an unconscious soundtrack to deception that had successfully concealed his participation in systematic harassment and institutional cover-up. The technology that had exposed Michael's calculated manipulation represented triumph of scientific progress over criminal deception that had seemed impenetrable using investigative methods available during the 1970s. The digital enhancement of analog recordings had revealed truth that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 4 decades, waiting for advances in audio forensics to unlock secrets that voice analysis could finally decode and understand. The investigation into Principal Crawford's systematic harassment was revolutionized when Detective Chen applied digital enhancement technology to school surveillance footage from 1976 that had been stored in the district's archives as part of routine documentation requirements that administrators had never expected would be subjected to modern forensic analysis. The grainy black-and-white security recordings, captured by primitive cameras that had been installed primarily to monitor building security rather than document interpersonal interactions, contained visual evidence that supported complaints that had been buried rather than investigated by school officials. The digital processing capabilities available in 2014 allowed forensic specialists to clarify images that had been previously too unclear for meaningful analysis, revealing Crawford's behavior patterns that demonstrated systematic targeting of female teachers who lacked institutional protection or political connections that might have provided defense against retaliation. The enhanced footage showed repeated incidents of inappropriate physical contact, intimidating body language, and isolation tactics that created opportunities for harassment, while minimizing witnesses who might have reported his conduct to higher authorities. Dr. James Wilson, the digital imaging specialist who processed the security footage, discovered evidence of Crawford's sophisticated understanding of camera placement and surveillance blind spots that had enabled him to conduct inappropriate interactions in locations where documentation would be difficult or impossible using 1970s technology. His positioning during interactions with female teachers revealed careful planning rather than spontaneous behavior, indicating systematic predation that had been enabled through detailed knowledge of building layout and security systems. The enhanced surveillance footage revealed Crawford's coordination with other school officials who provided cover for his inappropriate behavior, while ensuring that potential witnesses were isolated or transferred to positions where they couldn't effectively monitor his interactions with vulnerable teachers. The visual evidence documented institutional conspiracy that extended beyond simple individual misconduct to include systematic protection of predatory behavior that violated both professional ethics and criminal law. Chen's analysis of the footage revealed Crawford's pattern of targeting new female teachers during their probationary periods, when job security remained uncertain and resistance to administrative pressure could result in employment termination that would destroy their careers before they became established in the profession. His selection criteria demonstrated strategic thinking about vulnerability that maximized his power, while minimizing risks to his own position and reputation within the educational community. The technology that exposed Crawford's systematic harassment represented advances in digital imaging that had transformed law enforcement's ability to extract information from visual evidence that had previously seemed too poor quality for meaningful analysis. Computer enhancement algorithms could now clarify details, improve resolution, and reveal activities that had been hidden by technological limitations of original recording equipment that had captured events without providing usable documentation. The investigation revealed that Crawford's protected status within the school district hierarchy had been maintained through relationships with board members whose own careers and reputations were connected to educational outcomes that his administrative leadership had helped achieve despite personal conduct that violated professional standards and legal requirements. The institutional protection had been based on utilitarian calculations that weighed his educational effectiveness against moral and legal concerns about his treatment of female employees. Detective Chen's review of school board executive session minutes revealed discussions about Crawford's behavior that had been conducted in secret meetings, designed to prevent public awareness of problems that board members preferred to handle through quiet resolution, rather than formal investigation that might have attracted media attention and legal liability. The pattern of institutional cover-up had been systematic and coordinated among multiple officials, whose careers depended on maintaining educational stability and avoiding scandal. The enhanced surveillance footage also revealed the isolation and intimidation tactics that Crawford had used to prevent female teachers from developing supportive relationships that might have provided protection against his advances or encouraged formal complaints that could have triggered investigation and disciplinary action. His manipulation of work assignments, committee appointments, and social interactions had been designed to maintain his victims' vulnerability while preventing coalition building that might have challenged his authority. The discovery of visual evidence that documented Crawford's predatory behavior required notification of law enforcement agencies that had jurisdiction over crimes that might not have reached statute of limitations for prosecution, despite the passage of nearly 4 decades since the original incidents had occurred. The digital enhancement had transformed historical documentation into actionable evidence that could support criminal charges if living victims could be identified and encouraged to cooperate with prosecution efforts. Chen's investigation into Crawford's employment history revealed similar patterns of harassment at previous schools where he had worked before arriving in Cedar Falls, suggesting that his behavior had been systematic and ongoing throughout his career, while school districts had protected themselves through quiet resignations and positive references that had enabled his continued employment elsewhere. The institutional response had been to export problems rather than address them through proper investigation and accountability measures. The surveillance footage that had captured Crawford's harassment activities had been preserved through bureaucratic requirements that administrators had viewed as unnecessary documentation, rather than potential evidence of criminal behavior that could be analyzed decades later using technology that hadn't existed when the recordings were originally created. The accidental preservation of evidence had created opportunities for justice that seemed impossible when the harassment had originally occurred. The enhanced video evidence revealed the scope of Crawford's impact on the educational environment at Hawthorne Elementary, showing how his behavior had affected not only direct victims, but also other female teachers who modified their own behavior to avoid attracting his attention, while male colleagues remained either unaware of problems or unwilling to intervene in situations that seemed to require challenging administrative authority that could threaten their own job security. The digital clarification of decades-old surveillance footage represented a breakthrough that validated complaints that had been dismissed or minimized by officials whose primary concern had been institutional reputation rather than employee welfare and legal compliance. The technology had finally provided objective documentation of subjective experiences that victims had been unable to prove using evidence available during the original time period, when conventional investigative methods had been inadequate for exposing systematic institutional abuse. The forensic genealogy investigation that began with blood evidence from Maggie's letter led Detective Chen through a complex network of genetic databases and family tree reconstruction that required months of careful analysis before yielding results that would finally answer questions that had haunted the O'Sullivan family for nearly 4 decades. The scientific breakthrough came through advanced DNA analysis techniques that could extract genetic profiles from trace biological evidence that Maggie had inadvertently left on the letter paper when she had sealed it in its hiding place behind the apartment baseboard. The genetic profile developed from the letter evidence was submitted to genealogical databases that contained DNA information from millions of people who had voluntarily provided samples for ancestry research, creating an unprecedented resource for identifying individuals through family relationships rather than direct matches to criminal databases. The process required building comprehensive family trees that traced genetic connections through multiple generations, while accounting for adoption, name changes, and geographical migrations that had occurred over decades of American social mobility. Dr. Rebecca Morrison, the forensic genealogist who coordinated the analysis, discovered genetic matches that pointed toward the Pacific Northwest, where several distant relatives of the O'Sullivan family had established lives during the migration patterns that had characterized American demographics during the late 20th century. The process of narrowing geographical focus required analyzing genetic inheritance patterns, while considering historical migration routes and settlement preferences that might have influenced location choices for someone seeking to establish a new identity. The investigation led to Corvallis, Oregon, where a woman named Margaret Stevens had been teaching elementary school for 37 years after arriving in the community during 1977, with educational credentials that matched Maggie O'Sullivan's qualifications despite gaps in employment history that had been overlooked by administrators desperate for qualified teachers in rural districts that struggled to attract candidates from traditional recruitment sources. Detective Chen's careful approach to contact required coordination with Oregon law enforcement agencies, while respecting the possibility that Margaret Stevens might wish to maintain the identity that had provided protection and stability for nearly 4 decades of successful teaching in a community where she had established deep professional and personal relationships. The investigation had to balance law enforcement objectives with recognition that forced revelation of assumed identity could destroy the very safety and security that Maggie's original disappearance had been designed to achieve. The initial contact was made through intermediaries who could explain the purpose of the investigation, while providing Margaret Stevens with opportunities to control the extent of her cooperation with efforts to resolve questions that had remained unanswered since her departure from Cedar Falls in 1976. The careful approach acknowledged her agency in decisions about revealing information that could affect not only her own life, but also relationships with colleagues and community members who knew her only as Margaret Stevens, dedicated educator and respected community member. The woman who had been Maggie O'Sullivan agreed to meet with Detective Chen in a private setting that would protect her current identity while allowing discussion of circumstances that had forced her departure from her previous life and career in Iowa. Her decision to acknowledge her original identity represented courage that paralleled the bravery she had demonstrated 40 years earlier, when choosing disappearance over continued victimization by institutional systems that had failed to protect her from systematic harassment and abuse. Margaret Stevens described a life that had been built deliberately to honor her commitment to education, while providing the safety and professional autonomy that had been impossible to achieve in Cedar Falls due to Crawford's harassment and institutional protection that had made formal complaints seem more dangerous than silence. Her teaching career in Oregon had flourished in an environment where her dedication and competence had been recognized and rewarded without the complications of gender-based harassment that had poisoned her previous professional experience. The conversation revealed that Maggie had maintained awareness of developments in Cedar Falls through periodic internet searches that had informed her about Crawford's eventual retirement and the changes in educational policy that had provided better protections for harassment victims. But her decision to maintain her assumed identity had been based on understanding that revelation might still create legal complications and personal disruptions that could affect the stable life she had worked decades to establish and maintain. Her current classroom in Corvallis contained many of the same educational materials and organizational systems that had characterized her teaching in Cedar Falls, demonstrating consistency of professional values and pedagogical approaches that had survived the trauma of harassment and forced disappearance. The morning light that streamed through her Oregon classroom windows created the same illumination patterns that had once filled her Iowa classroom, providing visual continuity that connected her past and present identities through shared commitment to educational excellence. Detective Chen's final report documented the resolution of Maggie O'Sullivan's disappearance, while respecting Margaret Stevens' decision to maintain the identity that had enabled her survival and professional success, in circumstances where revelation of her original identity might have created more problems than it solved. The investigation had achieved its primary objective of answering questions about her fate, while acknowledging the complexity of justice in situations where victims had been forced to choose between truth-telling and personal safety. The notification of Thomas and Catherine O'Sullivan about their daughter's fate provided closure that was both triumphant and tragic, as they learned that Maggie was alive and successful, while recognizing that circumstances had forced her to abandon family relationships that had been among the most precious aspects of their lives. Their relief about her safety was tempered by grief about the cost of her survival and anger about institutional failures that had made such extreme measures seem necessary for basic personal protection. Margaret Stevens' story represented a form of justice that operated outside conventional legal frameworks while honoring moral principles that had guided her decision-making throughout a crisis that had tested her courage and commitment to education, despite systemic failures that had made normal career progression impossible in her original professional environment. Her success in building a meaningful life while maintaining her educational mission demonstrated resilience that had transformed personal trauma into lasting contribution to student learning and community welfare. The gentle morning light that had once illuminated Maggie O'Sullivan's classroom in Cedar Falls now filled Margaret Stevens' classroom in Corvallis, creating a bridge between identities that honored both the young teacher who had been forced to disappear and the experienced educator who had built a life dedicated to the same principles that had originally drawn her to the teaching profession before institutional abuse had disrupted her career trajectory and forced her to seek safety through radical transformation of her personal and professional identity. Did you like the story, and which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.